Hello, this is Jay Mitchell. We are back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first, we have the LA riots are a Trump ad posted by Lemon Limelight, and they said, from the Free Press, as the riots in Los Angeles rage on, one question keeps going through my brain: have Democrats learned anything? The chaos in Southern California could have been designed in a lab to exploit Democratic weak spots, combining the issues of illegal immigration, crime, and public disorder. Yet their most visible response to the anti-deportation riots in Los Angeles has been to denounce President Trump for sending National Guard troops to quell the riots. The situation, they insist, is under control, or at least it was until Trump intervened. The view was not shared by some in charge of or actually doing the quelling, as Los Angeles Police Chief Jim McDowell admitted at a Sunday evening press conference. We are overwhelmed. There might very well be a universe where it makes sense for Democrats already set with a dreadful image on crime and immigration to train their fire on Trump and the National Guard instead of anti-deportation rioters. However, it is not the universe we currently inhabit. Just as Trump has overrode his electoral mandate, going further and faster than many of his voters wanted, and pursuing many unpopular policies. Now the Democrats have assumed they have an anti-mandate to oppose more or less everything the president does. Missing from their calculus is how popular many of the president's policies remain, and that's especially true on the two issues in question on the streets of LA, law and order and illegal immigration. The public still generally approves of Trump's deportation program for illegal immigrants. Support is overwhelming when the focus is narrowed to those who've committed violent crimes, and the Republican Party still referred to Democrats on crime, policing, and immigration, with particularly wide margins among the working class. The Democrats risk going back to square one on the key issues undermining their brand. Recall that in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the nationwide movement sparked by it, the climate for police and criminal justice reform was highly favorable, but Democrats, taking their cue from progressive activists, blew it by allowing the party to be associated with toxic movement slogans like defund the police. Meanwhile, many Democratic officials declined to prosecute lesser crimes, degrading the quality of life in many cities under Democratic control. Since that low point, and particularly since Trump's November election, Democrats have made some modest progress in rehabilitating their image, but most Democrats are still reluctant to embrace an unapologetic law and order stance. Something along the line of Tony Blair's tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime would be a good Democratic mantra at the moment, as voters are still suspicious that the party is truly serious about tackling crime and quality of life issues. The events in California will only accentuate those suspicions. Democrats do not have to cheer on every ICE raid, but they have to be seen to prioritize law and order and not deny the reality on the ground of violent protests. With the exception of a few moderates, where some voting in California should be made glaringly obvious that Democratic officials aren't yet ready for the reckoning with their party's far left, voters are noticing and will act accordingly. And yeah, I would say I would agree with pretty much all that. Just because the riots are framed as being more in-group than out-group doesn't make them justified. I think it's interesting. Normally, when there's a riot, the state is usually expected to reinstate law and order, but since the Bad Orange Man is the one doing it, it's suddenly fascism if they do so. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the state, but if there is a chaotic riot, the state's usually the one who's supposed to quell it. But Gavin Newsom could have ordered the National Guard, but he didn't want to do that. He just let the riot burn because it was the in-group doing it, and he knew that Trump would probably call him the National Guard, and then he could call Trump a fascist as for his 2028 presidential campaign. So it's just really a pissing contest between the two of them, and yeah. I don't really care for it. That's what politics all really is at this point. It's just a pissing contest between celebrities, really much. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. And then we have NRA accidentally forgets to rise up against tyrannical government from the shovel, and that is posted from Mundane Image 13. And yeah, I don't really care for the NRA. I think, if anything, they're the moderates on the firearms issue. The Gun Owners America, GOA, is much better. But regardless, I definitely do agree that, the NRA definitely falls into the pitfalls of what many people do these days. They have the in-group good, out-group bad politics. And yeah, just because the Republicans might be the in-group when it comes to gun rights doesn't mean they're perfect on them. After the Las Vegas shooting, I think it was, or maybe it was one of the shootings back in the 2010s. It might have been the Florida high school shooting, but he said, take the guns first, due process second, and yeah, that's not very libertarian either. We might be better on guns than compared to someone like Kamala Harris, but maybe Stalin was better when it came to the Jews than Hitler. That's not really too much of an accomplishment. Then we have Senator Rand Paul says he's worried about the image of Trump's military parade, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the No Shit Sherlock subreddit. And yeah, I would agree with that. I personally don't really care for the whole military parade circle jerk Trump wants to have tomorrow for the military's birthday, and that's also his birthday. But if he wants to justify doing it, that's fine. I personally think it's a waste of money. But yeah, I don't really care for the whole military strongman angle that he's going for there. So I would agree with Rand Paul here. I personally really like Rand Paul. I think he treads the fine line between you don't want to get on Trump's too much of Trump's shit list or he'll come after you and have you primaried, but he does stand up to Trump when he's able to, and I really respect that from him, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Support the Libertarian Party of California, posted by FunKale321, and that's a meme. It looks like it's the Gadsden snake running away from the California bear, from the California flag, and the snake looks like it's saying, "Oh shit, a bear." And yeah, I personally think everyone should support the Libertarian Party in their area, so I would agree with this sentiment. Then we have Senator Alex Padilla forcibly removed from news conference held by Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem in Los Angeles from CBSNews.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Alex Padilla. I do think they were a little rough on him, but he had no right to be there, and that's a lot of Democrats. They think they should be able to do whatever they want to because Orange Man bad, and that's not true. Just because you're an elected official with a T-nex in the room doesn't mean you can just justify barging into wherever you want to. I do think it was a little rough to throw him out like that and handcuff him on the ground, but I don't think he's blameless either, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Rand Paul. If I say picture in your mind military parade, I challenge anybody not to think of the Soviet Union or North Korea. That's the only image that pops in my head, and it doesn't mean I hate the military. Missiles and tanks in the streets just isn't a great symbol of a free country, posted by B. Hurry, and that's cross-post from the We the Fifth subreddit. And yeah, I would agree with that. I don't really care for it, as I said earlier, but people will cope, and we'll move on to the next thing. I would say, I remember Trump wanted to do a military parade back in 2018 as well. That didn't pan out, so hopefully, it goes over well, and I don't really care for it, but yeah, it's just the latest. Whatever the latest circle jerk the Reddit shit libs are going on about, it's always something with them, and eventually they just move on to the next thing. And you just notice that after a while, it's just whatever the current outrage is. It's like the meme, it's the church of the current thing. I support the current thing. It's kind of like that. Then we have wildly inappropriate behavior. Mike Johnson slams Padilla after handcuffing from rawstory.com, posted by Puffin Fan. And yeah, as I said earlier, I do think, they were a little rough on Padilla, the guards, but, that doesn't mean he should have just been barging in there uninvited. And we have Judge blocks Trump administration from deploying National Guard to Los Angeles from CBSNews.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. That's cross-post from the r/law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think, I think, if the judge does want to block Trump from doing anything, they should be able to, but a lot of people are just going to defer to the president anyway, so, if he just wants to disregard the courts and just fight whatever he wants to, that's on him, I personally do think, the National Guard might be needed since it seems like it's something needs to be done to quell the riots, but, if the judge wants to say otherwise, that's on them, and if Trump wants to disregard him, that's fine. I think that's fine too. Ultimately power and the rule of law is whatever those in charge say it is, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have what could go wrong using your freedom of speech against police, posted from Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the What Could Go Wrong subreddit. And yeah, personally, I wouldn't try and agitate and yell at police like that, but if you want to agitate and use your freedom of speech to yell and agitate police, that's on you. Just don't be surprised if they justify using force against you, and there might be nothing you can do to stop them since they have the monopoly on legal use of force on their side. Then we have, why is the media ignoring the growing resistance to Trump, from TheGuardian.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally I think the media really just always covered Orange Man bad. They've been covering Orange Man bad for 10 years now, pretty much. he announced his candidacy for presidency in 2015. The 10th anniversary of that's this Monday when he went down the Golden Escalator. But yeah, of course on Reddit, they can never be doing enough. Reddit's always like, they're not doing enough. They need to say Orange Man bad more. And yeah, I don't really care for Trump, especially when it comes to some issues like Israel and tariffs. But the media is already extremely harsh on Trump, but it's never enough by Reddit standards. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, and people were saying Biden and Harris were running World War III from posted by Ragnar OKXD, and that's cross-post from the real Twitter account subreddit, and that says Rubio, U.S. is not involved in Israel attacking Iran. Trump, I take all the credit for Israel attacking Iran, and I'll do it again. And yeah, hopefully this doesn't get into some war with Iran. It seems like I think this is like the third or fourth time Israel struck Iran over the past year or two, but yeah, I do think cooler heads usually do end up prevailing, so I think it's just another one of the current outrages. I personally don't want war with Iran, but, we do seem to live in the world where nothing ever happens. And, I wish we could get either the World War III or the Civil War, whichever one comes out. But I wish we could just get them out of the way already. But, it just seems like people are just too busy circle jerking themselves on social media to actually do anything or else, and nothing ever happens. And yeah, I definitely am against war with Iran and war with any other country. I'm against regime change and all that. It's Iranians' business to handle their own country, not that of the U.S. But yeah, if Israel is going to pull the U.S. into a war with Iran, I'll be very much against it. But ultimately, I think Israel is the one really pulling the strings rather than Trump, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, hey libertarians, what made you become a libertarian, from Leroy's Lee, and they added, I would love to know what made you become a libertarian, whatever the reason was. I will share my story people so you can see what made me turn to the side of liberty. And they posted some paragraph, and yeah, personally I think libertarianism, it's all about individual rights, and people should be able to do whatever they want to as long as they're not hurting anyone else. So I think that's a very appealing life philosophy, and that's why I'm a libertarian. One of the big things that got me was I just found out another hobby, and I went to a local library and saw a book from Ron Paul there. I thought, I never had a libertarian phase. I probably should have. I always thought I'd probably grown out of it. But, I do think, being a libertarian is important because ultimately, you gotta stand up against all the bullies who want to bully their cultural standards onto you, whether it be the MAGA right or the woke left. And I think that's very important. You gotta stand up for the rights of the individual, since they're the smallest minority of all, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.